Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie.
No
Great to
worries.
be back.
Pleased to have you, Robert. How's the weather in Canada?
It's still pretty chilly. It's a little lower than normal,
Hmm.
and we had quite a bit of snow this week, so sort of buried in snow.
Okay.
But
No,
it's tolerable.
no,
Canadians are used to it, I guess.
that's it.
You
They're
get less used to it as you get older.
a hard, resilient lot. I think Australians are like that too, especially the those people who live outside the cities. There's a resilience there. Welcome, Wallace Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. I hope you're well. Our weather is pretty decent out here, but really you should take me as the authority because he comes from the east and the west is the most important part of the country.
Okay, a little bit of what do you call it? Provincial rivalry. It's all
Or
healthy.
maybe
It's
it's fraternal
it could be too
competition.
yeah, it could be. It could be a little bit of that too, because of course you're brothers. No worries. Okay, today's subject: war or peace. War or peace. And I think it's a very interesting subject because the situation that's unfolding around the world with this coronavirus and the ramifications of a shutdown of the Chinese economy, and of course it's moving out into other nations, and other nations are responding by shutting down whole suburbs, schools, factories, things like that. It really is having significant ramifications. It's not a previous, if you like, viruses have had nothing like the impacts that are currently unfolding. So this is a significant event, and I don't know that it was ever. It may have been thought about, but I don't know that it's ever planned, and the outcome has got the waves are going through. Anyway, your thoughts, Robert Klinck, war or peace?
Well, I have a son actually who's in China, and he has described to me the situation there. And having visited China 4 or 5 times and actually see it evolve. First time I went was in 2006. It was not at all the country it is today, with all this super development.
Hmm.
And he says the streets are empty and the restaurants are all shut down. The chairs are up on the tables. And he runs a school. People can't go to his school because you're not allowed to assemble in groups.
Hmm.
People are, if you do go out, you're going to be stopped, and a fever gun is going to be pointed at your head to make sure that you're not sick. And if you're driving a car, your trunk will be open to make sure that you're not hiding a bunch of sick people in the trunk. And so it's a really astonishing transformation to me because I've seen that place just bustling, and it's been shut down. So I don't understand how they could accomplish it, and I don't know how long they can persist with that kind of control.
Yeah.
So definitely, I guess they're trying to maintain peace in China because the people are tending toward panic, and panic, of course, results in conflict.
Hmm.
So, well, war or peace, I guess they're trying to deal with a situation like that in China right now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. No, significant. As I said, a significant event. And I don't know that they've got control of the situation. I think the fact that the media is starting to turn on Xi, the premier, whatever he is, president of China, the dictator, they're starting to turn on him. And I think that he has fallen out of favour. He's not handling this situation as they would have liked. When I say they, I'm talking about the money power, the world leaders behind governments. They're not happy with what's actually going on. Wally Klinck, your thoughts?
Well, I suppose whenever you start a conversation, you are using a title, war or peace in this case, and I think that you have to try and define your terms before you get too deep into an investigation. So what is war and what is peace? Do we really know what the difference is? We've lived under certain circumstances under the existing financial regime,
Mhm.
which has such a really potent effect on everything that we do, that I think that most people cannot really conceive of what real peace is, because we have not had peace for forever practically. And you're saying, yes, there's internal peace and there's external peace. There's peace within a nation because of the conditions that exist within the nation. And that is related to the relationships amongst nations. So what is it that drives for peace or conflict within the nation? And what is it that drives for conflict among nations? Are they related? Are they independent? Or what? Well, social credit says that every nation is afflicted by a price system which is non-self-liquidating. In other words, you have to go more and more into debt in order to live in the future. And this puts great pressure upon governments to try and deal with the so-called debt problem, which has just escalated and escalated and has been going up more steeply all the time because of the increase of technology and the increased component of overheads in prices, which are not distributed as income. So this puts a great pressure on governments, and they try and solve the problem by the external markets. They try and export more than they import. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, if you're dealing with someone and you make an exchange for something and you both go away happy, that's a peaceful situation. But if you have a situation at home domestically where you cannot you cannot liquidate your costs and the debts that are incurred in order to try artificially to deal with the situation, then of course you're going to transfer that basis of hostility and conflict to your external relationships. Because if you are successful in exporting more to another country than they're able to export to you, you're putting them under great pressure internally with regard to their economy. And of course, we know in the past that the result has usually been conflict and war, even World War.
Yeah, no, that's a very profound observation, Wally. And this conflict between nations, not only vying for market, but also, if you like, since the Gulf War, since the 90s, the invasions in the Middle East and the actual confiscation of the assets, generally oil. But I was reading the other day, and it was in regard to the Boer War, going back into the 1890s, mid-1890s, the Boer War. And that was over gold and diamonds in South Africa. And that was an expansion, if you like, of British policy to impose their will so that they could actually reap the benefits of the assets of another nation. So there are different thinkings on it, and but one nation vying for something that another nation has. And I think the most current example of rape and pillage of another nation is Venezuela. The most current example, where Chinese and Soviet troops are both in there at the invitation of their government, I believe, but it is to rape and pillage the vast reserves of heavy crude oil, the largest reserves in the world. And of course, the Venezuelan people, they're impoverished, they're in a state of destitution, but the communists have no trouble realizing those assets. And of course, this is to me is where you find the capitalist communist nexus coming together, because America's doing nothing about Venezuela, making a lot of noise, but actually doing nothing. The Soviet and Chinese troops are in there guarding the reserves, and of course they're being exploited. It really is a terrible state of affairs for Venezuela. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, I don't think that many people realize that there's actually an ideological rationale behind the promotion of conflict. And it goes back a very long time, and there's a continuous thread going back over 200 years at least of people whose theory it was that if you can maintain tension and conflict in society, then you can impose your will upon it, because people are driven by insecurity and even economic desperation to accede to whatever solutions for their problems you're proposing. So this goes back a long way. It's summarized in the Latin expression ordo ab chao, which means order out of chaos. There are actually people who believe in promoting chaos. It's been talked about recently in conservative circles in Great Britain. Some conservative politicians were talking about creative destruction. Well, these are conflicting ideas for most people. Most people think you progress by learning and applying your knowledge to raw materials and existing processes in order to improve them. But there are people who actually want to tear things down in order to induce such a state in society that people are willing to swallow all kinds of policies that are actually destructive of their freedoms and of their ability to run their own lives as they choose to do. So, well, it's a situation that has been financed by international finance, been promoted that way for many years. There's all sorts of historical proof of this. And so you see a convergence of the interests of say Marxist or socialist revolutionaries and the financial power, because they are both striving to centralize power. Now, the ordinary citizen will not go for this. Why would they go along with having power drained away from them to some external authority? But they will if sufficient pressure is applied to them by financial means. And the result of this is very destructive, because it places everybody in a position of competition, exaggerated competition with their fellow man. It places nations in a situation of exaggerated competition among them, and it tears away at the potential for peace in society in every respect.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. That's a very, again, another profound analogy, illustration of what's actually transpiring in front of us. The thing is that if you look at a student at university competing for better grades against the other students, vying for the same job vacancy in order to secure a future, and then of course, if they achieve that job vacancy, the company that they work for vying for market share against other companies. And so you see this competition moving past healthy and becoming quite desperate, becoming quite ruthless, becoming quite so exaggerated or amplified, because there is so much pressure being exerted against individuals, companies, nations. So much pressure exerted, and of course vying for market to do what? To balance the books. And yet the books are designed to never balance. And so it's actually inherent in the design to actually, yes, create order out of chaos, but first of all to create chaos. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Well, to put it shortly, the idea of creating chaos, obviously, you cannot go on in a state of chaos. Something has to emerge in order to control a situation. In other words, what these people are doing, they're actually trying to create chaos so that they can emerge with control. It's a centralizing policy.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite diabolical, really. It is. And with the students, I mean, the students, they are faced with their future life and trying to make some success of it. are they being encouraged to search for truth, or are they being encouraged to seek for security? Well, as human beings, we all have a survival instinct, which is only normal and it's absolutely essential. But I mean, why should we be put in a position where we can turn a blind eye to things which are not ethical or are not sound if we think we might jeopardize our chance for a promotion or for a future security?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people go to university and they close their eyes to that and they try and prepare themselves, hoping that they can fit into society and make a success of things.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that is becoming more and more difficult to do. The problem is we're searching more and more. In olden times, people and nations competed over real things. There were real shortages. They would look for land, they would look for resources and hunting resources and so on and so forth, the things that they needed to survive. Today, we have an enormous abundance of real things. We are not short of real things. What we're short of is the ability to sell those things. But not only the ability to sell them, but because we do compensate for that, or we profess to compensate by going into debt and mortgaging the future in order to get the incomes which we can use to obtain these goods, but it's not really income because it is an obligation that you've incurred against your future.
Mm-hmm.
If you had real income, like you would your wages, and you spend it, you get what you bought, and that's the end of it. But we have to go far and far and beyond our wages. As I say, businesses do not just pay out wages, salaries, and dividends. They have enormous overheads. Overheads are costs that business assume, but they do not distribute money or incomes in respect of those overhead charges, which they add to wages, salaries, and dividends. They allocate these charges. They don't distribute them as incomes. And so increasingly, the consuming public is just incapable more and more and more of buying what's being produced with their earned income. And they're having to go more and more into debt, and governments go more and more into debt in order to assist them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get the role of finance. The role of finance becomes greater and greater through financing government, and government role in administering the lives of the people grows at the same time. So that's the way the debt is used. Here in Alberta, we had a government that was sailing along on exports of oil, energy. Then we went to an NDP government, which is a socialist administration, and they just let the debt go wild. It was just expanding exponentially. And now, because of the efforts to shut down our source of export income, we have we've elected a so-called conservative government, and that conservative government's solution to the problem is to cut back on things, to try and balance the budget in a situation which is quite impossible, because you can't balance a budget when you don't have enough money in the first place to buy what's out there.
Mm.
You have to go in debt, whether you're an individual or whether you're a government. But the thing of it is, it represents a constant, subtle, not so subtle in a way, increase or centralization of power in the hands of the state over the lives of the people. Now you have to ask yourself, is this a normal situation? Is this just the way the world goes? Or is there something causing this? Is there something that is behind the whole thing, is making it, aggravating the situation and making it worse all the time? And of course, social credit says it is a financial system which simply is not designed for the modern industrial capital-intensive world, because it does not provide enough purchasing power. The economy does not provide enough purchasing power. We have to go more into debt. The debt gets taken on more and more by the state. But when the state takes it on, the state spends the money that is created in borrowing that money and incurring the debt. And that means that the state is taking over more and more of your life functions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is this a normal situation, or is it a sign of some kind of pathology?
Yeah.
Well, social credit says it's a pathological situation that's due to a financial system that does not account properly or distribute properly the real wealth that we have. Today we're fighting over the representation of money, whereas in the old days of genuine scarcity, they fought over genuine scarcity. Today we're fighting over an abundance of goods, but an inability to access them because we have to go more and more into debt.
The social credit proposal to compensate, to offset this going into debt, to place it into equilibrium, referred to as two things. One is the national dividend, an issue of new credits, debt-free credits, to the individuals in society so that they can actually have sufficient spending power to liquidate the costs of industry. They can buy what's on the shelf because they carry enough spending power in their wallets, either in cash or in credits in their bank account. They don't have to go into further debt. So it stops the debt juggernaut in its right where it is. It stops it. And then, of course, with this new issue of credit to the individual, there may appear to be upward financial pressures for the cost of things to actually rise, inflationary pressures. So to offset this inflationary pressure is the consumer price discount or consumer price subsidy. Two very important tools. It's time to run the experiment. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, exactly, Arnie. Life seems to become increasingly precarious economically as our progress proceeds in developing new technologies and finding easier and easier ways of providing the material necessities of life. It's a strange irony, but it's an irony that is artificial, and it is maintained, as we've said, because there are people who want to reassert or reaffirm their positions of control over the rest of society. Now, normal people, I don't think, have that ambition, and therefore they have some difficulty, perhaps, in understanding that there is an element of society that thinks that way. But there's no doubt that this precariousness of existence is deliberately imposed on society. You can just see the contrast between our potential means of having a good, secure material existence and the insecurity that people feel. Everyone feels, even people who have good jobs. They know that could disappear from one day to the next. So, we have a situation now where if a job is available, you can have hundreds of people applying for it. It's like a scramble. It's almost sometimes an animalistic competition because people are so desperate in order to have this means of income. So the material wealth is around us in every way, but the means of accessing it through having adequate income is not. And just as the productive potential of society grows, the consuming capacity of society should be adjusted so that it follows that progress. It isn't now. There's nothing automatic about the process. It gets increasingly out of synchronization, and you have a stopgap measure in the form of burgeoning debt. I mean, the debt is in figures now that are almost unimaginable. They're astronomical figures. But all that happens in politics is that one group comes along and says, well, we're going to diminish the debt, but all they do is transfer it around among different interests. So the national government will transfer it to regional governments, and they'll try to transfer it to municipal governments. The debt doesn't diminish. The debt is continually growing, but they play around with this balancing act, and that is used to distract people and keep their attention from the fundamental problem that we face.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course with the climate scare, the climate manipulation, or the climate thesis that we're global warming and we have to respond by decarbonising our economic systems and to hand over our industries. I noted that China still considers itself as a developing nation, and therefore it has no intention of reducing its carbon dioxide emissions before 2050. Here it is, the second most productive nation in the history of the world. It has no intention of altering anything. So obviously, in the great scheme of things, China continues on as this juggernaut. But the climate change scare, the climate change thesis, is all about deconstructing, if you like, the resourcefulness of the West and handing it to third world nations. And of course, the West is left with this huge debt because it's impossible to redeem the debt. And all it becomes is just giant pits for export, giant pits of products, whether it's oil or gas or iron ore or aluminum or whatever it is, bauxite, whatever. All these giant pits that just go out to these third world nations because they're entitled to continue on. And through the Lima Declaration, they can continue on developing their infrastructure, their nation, at the expense of the West. And so the West is actually, if you like, double hamstrung on this whole thing. Double hamstrung. It's got this huge debt, and its industry, as a matter of policy, is going offshore, being deconstructed. So it really is getting hammered. But the thing is, to me, that's part of the smokescreen. This climate thing is part of the smokescreen to take our eyes away from the real issue. And the real issue, of course, is where money comes from, who controls it, and what inordinate power they exercise over the individual, over communities, over nations. Wally Klinck.
Yes, there's no doubt about that, Arnie. It is part of a conscious worldwide movement. The problem is you have here a movement which is basically saying that capitalism is an evil thing. That they point to all the failures or all the problems that we had along the way, and they say that capitalism has caused misery in the world, and it's selfish, and it's. But the problem is, it's not capitalism. Capitalism is a word. What does it mean? Again, people throw these words around. They throw them all over the place, and not taking the time to define them. Capitalism is the use of tools, hammers, shovels, factories. That is capital. That is real capital. We have also financial capital, which is used to activate real capital. So, I mean, any nation that has tools, and every nation has to have some tools, is a capitalist nation to one degree or another. But it operates under this umbrella of finance, which perverts the entire process and causes us to have crises like booms and busts and all of these major turmoil and difficulties that we run into. And that makes people think that capital, that is the use of tools, is wrong. So because it's in private hands. And so they say that you have to put it all in public hands and arrange your affairs by plan and direction, centralized direction. Well, it simply does not work because human beings are not like that. We are propulsive, we are creative, we are imaginative, we have initiative, and we have a curiosity. We have an insatiable curiosity about life. We want to do things. But the problem is, under the present financial system, the results of our activities do not flow outward. I mean, a producer, a factory owner, cannot possibly consume what he produces today because the productive capacity is so enormous. Somewhere there's got to be a dispersion. Otherwise, you're going to get a backup, and then you get a recession. But you see, in the case of the left, they get you more and more into debt. And then the so-called right or the conservatives, they come along and say, oh, this is terrible. We shouldn't be spending more than we have. So we're going to cut back. Well, that puts people into bankruptcy. And then the financial institutions, the banks and those other institutions that surround them, foreclose on the real assets of the community. That is the centralization of the ownership and control of real assets. That is the communist objective. The so-called right and the left and the conservatives are so bullheaded about this thing. They think, oh no, you just got to make it easier for people to do things and it'll all work out fine. Well, it won't work out fine if you've got a system of representation that misrepresents the nature of your relationships. It's not going to work out fine, and it hasn't worked out fine. Eric Butler wrote an article, Financial Ignorance, the Achilles heel of the conservative movement. And they, in fact, are working together synergistically in order to accomplish the end of centralization control of the means of production and administration of society, because they don't really believe that ordinary human beings are capable of doing that. But when they get put in a position of central planning, they usually make a supreme mess out of it. Because we have natural law or we have everything run by human law. And I think natural law, being prior and more fundamental, is a far more important consideration than notional human ideas about how we should do things.
Yeah, very
especially
important.
when it's applied to centralized control over other people. Yeah. Very dangerous.
It is, and you're actually, what you're doing is you're defying natural law, and that is, of course, the inherent flaw in every individual. The more power they have, perhaps the more they want, but then there's corruption that comes into them, and in the end, the corruption becomes absolute, and they are completely corrupted. That's what power can do. So, so there's no halos on these people. It's to me, it's so important. Sir James Goldsmith, in his book The Trap, recorded the actual transition of power from in the European Union from the what were the heads of states to the technocracy, to the actual bureaucrats. And now Europe is run by technocrats. The parliament that they have, the European Parliament, they don't vote on anything of any consequence. The laws come from the technocrats. The actual policy comes from the technocrats, and they can't be overruled by the parliament. It's most important. It's a totalitarian system. Things have not changed. It's something we need to take into account if we're to actually start to deconstruct this juggernaut. We're at the 32-minute mark. It's been a very interesting discussion. War or peace? Your closing thoughts and comments, Robert Klinck.
Well, in order for us to have peace, we must have an idea of what peace will consist of. And peace will consist of individuals being able to pursue their own ends, not being particularly envious of anybody else because they have sufficient means to achieve those ends. So as long as that is not being provided, we have a state of inevitable conflict in society. And Christ set an example with regard to this issue of power when he rejected power, when he was allegedly directly tempted to take all power, all political power in the world, and he rejected that and said man does not live by bread alone, and he told Satan to take a hike. And this was, you know, allegedly a perfect man who should have been able to run the world in the most perfect manner imaginable. But he rejected that temporal power because he was saying that it is not natural for one man or a group of men to have that control over the others. It's a tremendous lesson we were given there. And yeah, I think it is not, you know, I think actually that Christ came to tell us what was the application of natural law in human relations. I think maybe he assumed that the technology would sort of take care of itself because every society will evolve the means of providing for itself in material means, but it doesn't necessarily have a successful approach to human relations. But Christ came, and all the lessons he gave were directed toward reaffirming the right of individuals to choose and the importance of having they're having this freedom.
Yeah.
It was consistent through everything he did. So the lesson, the primary lesson he gave to us was what the application of natural law in human relations. I've been thinking about this recently, and I thought that's probably what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. How people get on and how they should get on and how they can get on. Such a profound statement. Observation, Robert. It really, really is important. We call this social credit. That's where the title comes from. The social cohesion or faithful dealings. How people get on. Your thoughts and closing comments, Wallace Klinck.
Yes, social credit is the ability to move on, progress, and improve because of human association and the results that flow from it. But power without responsibility is illegitimate. The individual has to be in a position whether or not he will accept something that is proposed. Because if you don't have that, you don't have freedom. And if you don't have freedom, you're not a human being, because you're not allowed to express yourself, to be as a human being, because we're creative human beings. We're imaginative. We're not just to be put in a box. We're supposed to be able to explore this universe and to enjoy life, to experience life. And so when you get power without responsibility, it represses that. And that's one of the reasons why those who of the Marxist persuasion who are highly materialistic are so intent on making a war upon the Christian idea, because they believe that through the seeming enormous nature of their ego, or whatever it is, they think that they can supplant natural law. In fact, they resent natural law because it puts a constraint upon them to control other people. And that's why you see this authoritarianism in the left movement. And but on the other hand, I will say on the so-called conservative side, and it applies to everyone basically, but especially on the conservative side, they are very, very upset about anyone getting something for what they say is nothing. Well, this is absolutely absurd, because the product of industry today is not. Sure, if it was a product that emanated from human effort, then you can relate incomes to human input and to human effort. But our inputs, all these overheads and things that are received as an inheritance from the past, they're becoming greater and greater relative to labor. As a matter of fact, labor is gradually getting displaced from the area of production. So then what we're doing, we're following the idea of salvation through works. Now, you either is your salvation due to your works, regardless of their quality, or is it due to your purity of soul? How good a person you are, how loving you are. I mean, and I think the conservatives they are suffering a constant penalty of pride. Their pride is making them say, we are demonstrating that we are superior because we are producing. And these lazy people over here are not producing. Well, the thing of it is, the lilies of the field and the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea and the beasts of the field, as Christ said, they don't toil. And yet God knows they have these needs, and they're provided. So why should we demote ourselves as human beings as being something lesser than these other forms of life? I mean, it's very perverse, and it is pride, because, oh, well, that guy over there, he's no good. He's lazy. He doesn't get anywhere because he's just lazy. And I work hard. I earn what I get. You see, it's pride. And you know what happens from pride? Pride blinds, and then you stumble.
Yeah, yeah. We can all fall into that trap of pride, and no doubt if we're a lot of self-reflection, we can look at our own sin first. and not that man over there who appears to be doing nothing. You don't know his story. You have not lived in his shoes. So how dare you stand in judgment on him? That's right. It's been a very interesting discussion this morning, gentlemen. War or peace? It's before us, and we do have a choice, and we can pursue, but we need to recognise the powers that be. We need to recognise how we're being manipulated. Even our thinking is being manipulated, so we can't actually resolve. And there's no intention of resolving the conflict. The conflict is actually part of the design, and so resolution is most important to stop the dialectic, to overcome and find equilibrium in the dialectic rather than conflict. Thank you so much, Robert and Wally Klinck.
Thank you, Arnie. Very nice to be with you. I always enjoy talking with you.
No
Thank you,
worries.
Arnie.
Cheers then.